Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 166, Baseball and the Forgotten Effects of the Korean War on America's Pastime. Joining me on today's episode to discuss this very unique subject is Steve Gietschier, author of the new book, Warm Summers and Cold Winters, How Baseball Survived the Korean War. Now, this is an area I have never discussed on Sports Forgotten Heroes, and not only does it fit our genre because so few know or remember much about the Korean War, but there were players whose careers were significantly affected by the war, and their contributions to baseball have long been forgotten as well. Before we get there, though, a few notes. Please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Look for our page on Facebook. And wherever it is you are listening or watching, please give Sports Forgotten Heroes a like. And if you can, a 5-star rating and a review. Also, if you have an idea for a forgotten hero that you would like to know more about, please send me an email to sportsfh.info@gmail.com. That's sportsfh.info@gmail.com. And as always, I thank you for your support. Also, I'd like to tell you about my first book, College All-Stars versus NFL Champions, the Chicago Charities Football Games 1934 to 1976. Now, this book takes a look back at the history of the series where a team of college football all-stars took on the defending NFL champions every year from 1934 until 1976. Of course, 1967, the defending NFL champions became Super Bowl champions. You can pick up a copy of the book on Amazon or straight from the publisher. That's McFarlandBooks.com. That's McFarlandBooks.com. And if you want more information about the book or a signed copy, again, please send me an email to sportsfh.info@gmail.com. That's sportsfh.info@gmail.com. And I'll share with you how we can make it happen. Okay, let's get into today's show with my guest, Steve Gietschier. Steve, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. I am thrilled you can join. Quite the interesting topic.
Thank you, Warren. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, your book, Warm Summers and Cold Winters, How Baseball Survived the Korean War, published by Bloomsbury Academic, is really an interesting read. I don't think many people think about the Korean War, at least in terms of its effect on professional sports, particularly baseball. We know we talk about how World War II and World War I affected sports, but we very rarely go back to the Korean War, a war that my father was a part of. Steve, what drew you to the Korean War as the backdrop for this book, and why do you think it remains the forgotten war when it comes to American history? And by the way, the forgotten war fits perfectly with the topic of the show, Sports Forgotten Heroes.
That's right. What a nice coincidence. Well, it's a bit of a long story. I did my graduate work in history at Ohio State in the 1970s. And at a certain point, after taking lots of classes and reading dozens, if not hundreds of books, you have to come up with a title, a topic for your doctoral dissertation. And some graduate students find it easy to come up with a topic and some struggle a bit. And I was in that second camp. Now, I had a professor, a man named Gary Richard, who was a friend of mine, still is a friend of mine, and he had done his graduate work at Cornell, and one of his professors had written a book about the home front during World War II. Very interesting book called War and Society, still in print. And so Gary said to me, he said, Pollenberg did the home front during World War II. Why don't you try the home front during the Korean War? And I said, that sounds interesting. I know the book. It kind of gave me a template. But he said, remember, this is only a doctoral dissertation. So don't do the entire United States. Just center on things that were going on in Ohio, because I was at Ohio State. So I did that. I wrote the dissertation. I don't think it's the greatest dissertation that's ever been written. It didn't become a book. And the word baseball does not appear in it at all. So here
Interesting.
we are, some 50 years later, almost 45 years later, uh, and I kind of resurrected my interest in the Korean War because I've become, over the years, a baseball historian, and I thought the intersection of the two would make for an interesting analysis. That, yeah,
It certainly does. Yeah. How did labeling the Korean War a police action shape both public perception and baseball's response to it?
yeah, I think that was a critical decision. Um, Some people credit President Truman with coining the phrase police action, but actually, he was responding to a reporter's question in the early days of the conflict. Mr. President, are we at war? Or would you call this a police action? And Truman latched onto that phrase. He said, yes, we're engaged in a police action under the auspices of the United Nations. The fear, of course, when the attack occurred on June 25th, 1950, was that this was going to be, in some sense, Pearl Harbor all over again. The North Korean invasion of the South was a surprise. It was not as devastating for Americans as Pearl Harbor was, but the wife of the Army Chief of Staff turned to her husband when they got the news, and she said, does this again mean war? And he didn't have a good answer for her. Over the next weeks and months, the United States tried to convince people that this would not be total war like World War II, that this would be a limited war or a police action, that most of American society could go on living the civilian life, and we could fight this war with one hand behind our backs. The phrase that we associate with Vietnam was also used during Korea. Americans could supply both guns and butter.
I'm not going to get into a whole big political discussion, but it sort of sounds a little similar to what's happening right now.
Well,
At
it
least,
certainly was similar to what happened in Vietnam. Those people who think about Korea sometimes think of it as like a footnote or an afterword to World War II. But really, I think it's a precursor to what happened in Vietnam, a limited war, the idea that for most Americans, we're not going to get involved. Um, World War II was a total war. It affected everybody, soldiers and citizens and civilians alike. Korea, not so much. So the
mhm,
question is, what's our commitment? What's our objective? What's our goals? How do we know when this war is over?
mhm. Your book blends war chronology with baseball narrative. And you sort of, you go back and forth, sort of like many TV shows we see today, or, where you start off today and then you go back years ago. And then you come back to today and then you go back years ago. And your book has a similar feel to it. Why that structure, and how important is that structure in telling the story?
Well, I think structure or organization is one of the first decisions that an author has to make. You have the material, you know basically what you want to say, but how do you organize that material? We have to recognize, I think, that history is chaos, but we try to make sense of it in order to understand it without forgetting that it's chaos. So organizing the material is a key decision. And the other key decision enforced upon me by the publisher was a word limit, which is
I,
really helpful.
yeah,
Otherwise, this book would not have been published yet. I'd still be writing it. 80,000 words. Then you figure it covers 4 years, 4 calendar years, 1950, 51, 52, and 53. 4 baseball seasons are directly affected. So you say, well, 4 seasons, 80,000 words, 20,000 words a season, maybe 4 chapters, winter, spring, summer, fall, and you've got some kind of skeleton, some kind of structure onto which to hang the meat and potatoes.
yeah, it's interesting. I just finished my second book. It's in the process now of being reviewed and all. But my first book just came out, College All Stars versus NFL Champions, and they talked about how many words it needs to be, and I was in that area, and I just got done with a conversation with another author, and he's struggling because they wanted around 100,000, and he's written 600,000 words. I'm like, you need to make volumes. You have a book series. You can't kill 500,000 words.
No, you can't nickel and dime your way to those kinds of changes. No.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so I kept an eye on the word count as I was proceeding. And in each chapter I'd say, okay, that's enough,
yeah,
summarize, move on. And
exactly.
and so each chapter has 3 sections, um, 2 on baseball and one on the war, on diplomatic or military affairs. So yeah.
You sort of touched upon this just a little bit ago. How different was the Korean War home front compared to World War II, particularly when it comes to baseball?
Sure. Um, well, I think overall the atmosphere in the country during World War II was that, in a certain sense, every American was playing a part in trying to win the war, to defeat Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. You may be in the military or the Navy yourself. You may have a family member who was in the service. But even if you weren't, you were doing or not doing certain things that directly contributed to the war effort. Everybody had the opportunity to say, I'm doing my part, including, for example, rationing certain materials, rubber, for example, gasoline, sugar, were rationed. You couldn't buy unlimited quantities of those things. And when you made those sacrifices, you could do so with a smile on your face, knowing I'm helping to defeat the Nazis by doing this or by not buying this. Korea was completely different. It was as if Uncle Sam said, I want you, but you can stay home and go to college. I want you, but you can stay home, keep your civilian job, and make lots of money. That creates tension. It creates antagonism. It creates uncertainty, and it creates opportunity. As far as baseball is concerned, um, baseball had to face the same questions it faced during World War II. First of all, will there be baseball? Or will the sport be allowed to continue? And secondly, if we are allowed to continue, who gets to play and who doesn't get to play because they're being called into military service? That's one of the key challenges that baseball
Mhm,
faced.
mhm. You say or you argue that baseball was somewhat unstable before the war. What were the biggest cracks in the foundation of baseball heading into 1950?
Well, immediately after World War II, baseball attendance booms, and it looks to owners and to the commissioner as if prosperity is here and it's here to stay. But underneath all that, there are all kinds of problems. First of all, the sport's racial desegregation was far from complete. Secondly, Americans were beginning to move south and west, while baseball, Major League Baseball, was still centered exclusively in the North and the East. But before the franchises began to move, remember the westernmost team and the southernmost teams were the two teams in St. Louis, the Cardinals and the Browns. But the population is moving, and people want and they want Major League Baseball. Baseball is also struggling to deal with this new thing called television. As people decide to stay home, not go to the ballpark because they want to watch television. They want to watch the Goldbergs. They want to watch Bishop Sheen. They want to watch Milton Berle. They want to watch television because television itself is mesmerizing. The ballparks in which major league teams played were many of them old, decrepit, and perhaps needed to be replaced as people are leaving the cities for the suburb. Financially, clubs are spending enormous sums on bonus players, signing players, first-year players, this is before the draft, first-year players to enormous contracts, signing bonuses, and wondering, are they going to get a return on their investment? In addition, baseball suffers through a leadership crisis, firing one commissioner, Happy Chandler, and taking its time to appoint his successor, Ford Brick. There were legal problems. Several players sued baseball over the reserve clause, and a congressional subcommittee held hearings in the summer and early fall of 1951 about baseball's antitrust status and about the reserve clause. So those are the problems that baseball brings into the Korean War years and doesn't solve during the war years and doesn't solve them until later, if they solve them at all.
Mm-hmm. Looking at the teams and the rosters, how did the draft specifically impact rosters and competitive balance across the league during that time?
Okay. Well, I'm not sure we had competitive balance to begin with. You know, in the American League, starting in 1947 and then 1949, 50, 51, 52, and 53, the Yankees win the American League pennant and they win the World Series. And there were a bunch of teams in the American League that pretty much were out of the pennant race on opening day. The National League, almost the same. 1947, 1949, 1952, and 53. The Dodgers win the National League pennant. 1950 is the Philadelphia Phillies, the Whiz Kids, 1951, the Giants, Bobby Thompson's home run. But the other teams are pretty much also-rans. You know, I live in suburban St. Louis, and we know here that the Cardinals won the World Series in 1946, and they didn't appear in what we now call the postseason for 18 years until 1964. So not so much competitive balance. But to answer your question about the draft, we've got two things happening here. We've got people who have fulfilled part of their military obligation and are in the reserves and might get called up, or who have joined the National Guard and might get called to active service. And then we get people who are drafted. There is no list of every professional baseball player, major league and minor league, who were drafted during the Korean War. My guess is if such a list were compiled, it would include at least 1,000 players and maybe as many as 2,000. And about 250 players, major leaguers, before, during, or after, were called to military service during the Korean War.
Yeah, so I was going to go there next. I was going to ask you about how many players roughly do you think served during the Korean War, and does that number actually reshape how we view this era?
Well, I think so, sure. Think of the New York Giants as just one example. The Giants in 1951 have a young player in Minneapolis named Willie Mays, and DeRocher calls him up in the spring, in May, I think, and he leads the Giants to the pennant in 1951. The Giants also win the pennant in 1954, but they don't win the pennant in 52 and 53. Where's Mays? He's in the Army.
Mm.
Mays' presence may have rewritten National League history. You know, Mickey Mantle is a rookie in 1951, but he has physical ailments that prevent him from being drafted, so he never serves in the military. The Phillies are on their way to the National League pennant in 1950. The Phillies owner has been really cagey. He's had two of his best players, well, two pitchers. One of them, Curt Simmons, a really good pitcher. He's had them enlist in the National Guard as a way to fulfill their military obligation without losing playing time. But which National Guard unit is the first to be called up after the North Korean attack? Curt Simmons. He's not present when the Phillies win the pennant, and he's not present when the Phillies play the Yankees in the World Series and lose 4 games straight. Would he have made a difference? Certainly. Would the Phillies have won the series? Who knows? But he's gone for 50, 51, and part of 52. And the Whiz Kids, as we know, never win another pennant. So it makes a difference. But more than on the team level, it makes a difference to individuals. You know, you're playing minor league baseball or you're playing Major League Baseball, and then you get called for 2 years or a year and a half of active duty somewhere in the United States or in Europe or in some cases in Korea itself. What does that do to your playing skills? Even if you get to play baseball at, say, a military base in California, are you keeping your skills as finely honed as they would be if you were playing Major League Baseball? You know, you lose 2 years of a career. Some of these guys were in the majors, went into the Army, and never played Major League Baseball again.
Yeah. Was there anything that surprised you about the number of players whose careers were interrupted or ended by military service?
Yeah. Well, the numbers, I think, and the fact that we don't have a list. A couple of people have tried to compile lists. I used those lists. They're not complete. And I think the people who compiled them would say they're not complete. If you include minor leaguers, there may be as many as 2,000 players who had their careers interrupted, and about 250 major leaguers. A lot of these major leaguers were guys who were in the minors, then went into the Army, and when they came out, played Major League Baseball. One example, Vernon Law, the pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates. And a friend of mine who was interested in this same subject actually interviewed some of these players. And one of the questions he asked them was, did your military service affect your playing ability, your talent, your baseball career? And some of them said no, but most of them said yes, and some of them said yes in a very forthright way. Let me give you just one example. Maybe some of your listeners will remember a catcher with the White Sox named J.W. Porter. He was signed to a huge bonus. Didn't make his major league debut until July of 1952, but in 53 he's drafted. Now he does not go to Korea. He spends his entire military service time at Fort Ord in California. And he told my friend Ron Kaplan, who interviewed him, he said, the company I was in originally sent to Korea About 90% of them didn't make it back, but he had been transferred. And when Ron asked him, did serving in the Army hamper your career? He said, the answer is unprintable. So I will simply say, damn betcha.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's just one.
90%
Yes.
didn't return. That's crazy.
Yes. Yes.
What were the biggest challenges that owners face trying to run baseball, both as a sport and as a business during that?
Okay. There were two challenges. The first is roster construction. How do we fashion our roster? Once we know that baseball is going to continue, how do we fashion our roster to make sure we've got players who can play at a major league level? If we sign young players, if we rely on young players, how do we know that he might be in a major league uniform today and an Army uniform next week? That's a problem. Branch Rickey is running the Pirates at the time. He's left the Dodgers.
Mhm.
In the minor league draft of December 1950, he drafts older players he hopes will be beyond the age at which they would be called to military service. Rickey's got a plan, of course, to build the Pirates into a pennant winner, which eventually happens in 1960. But he kind of goes in the opposite direction. But teams were always concerned. Anybody could get a draft call at any time from a local board. He could be on your roster this week and gone a couple of weeks or a couple of months after that if he passes his physical. So on the field, the real question is roster construction. And this is not something that just affects teams in 1950. It affects them in all four seasons, 50, 51, 52, and 53. Off the field, they have to deal with some financial situations because even though President Truman called the war a police action or a limited war, in October of 1950, it's not just North Korea fighting South Korea and the United States, but it's China that has entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops pour across the Yalu River into North Korea and actively fight Americans. And the president's response is to ask Congress to declare a national emergency. He worked with Congress, and after he gets the powers that come to him in this national emergency, he imposes wage and price controls. The fear is that consumer goods will develop shortages and prices will escalate, inflation. The way to control inflation in this situation, the government believes, is to say nobody can raise your prices and nobody can get a raise. Well, that's great, well, not great, but it's easier to understand for people who are working for an hourly wage, for factory workers. If you know you're making, $8 an hour, and when you go to the grocery store that a loaf of bread is going to cost 12 cents, and next week it's still going to cost 12 cents, and the week after that it's still going to cost 12 cents because prices can go up, then you're not so desperate to get a raise. But baseball players and baseball team owners say, well, we agree with wage and price controls, but aren't baseball players special? Don't they have special talent? Don't they have limited careers? And so do those regulations apply to us? So baseball teams had to deal with the government regulations that came prior to the 1951 season and prior to the 1952 season and try to deal with them. The government rule in 1951 was no raises for individual players. If you played for $8,000 a year in 1950, that's what your salary will be in 1951. And a year later, they revised the regulations, and they said, well, individual salaries can fluctuate, but the total team payroll cannot increase. In other words, A salary cap.
Ha! So baseball once had a salary cap.
Yeah, well, kind of, kind of. The regulations get very in the first case, the poster child for what should we do about individual salaries is Stan Musial, because he has just prior to the regulations being enacted, he had signed a 2-year contract with the Cardinals calling for a raise from $50,000 a year to $75,000 a year.
25,000 back then is a big
Yeah.
number.
And so Stan says, hold on, I've already signed this contract. Do I get this money? That took months to figure out. And the next year, when teams are told that there's a salary cap, Walter O'Malley, who's running the Dodgers, said, hold on, I've already signed 2/3 of my team to contracts for 1952. Are you telling me that I've got to reduce the salaries of the other guys? Or do we have to rip up contracts that have already been signed?
Yeah,
These are tough questions.
Yeah, not going to happen.
No, not going to happen. And so those are the two big questions that baseball has to deal with. Who's going to play and how much are they going to be paid?
Well, speaking of who's going to play, you sort of answered this earlier, but why were so few, at least from what I could tell, so few active major leaguers actually in combat in the Korean War compared to other wars?
Well, I don't know if it was so different from World War II. I mean, we know that Bob Feller was on a Navy ship and was in harm's way throughout the war. Well, we know that Warren Spahn was in the infantry and fought at the Battle of the Bulge, but there were an awful lot of ball players who were either stationed in the United States during World War II or stationed abroad, and their job was playing ball. Camp commanders, post commanders all had baseball teams, and if they could get their hands on a couple of major leaguers to win the games, which were put on to quote entertain the troops, that was a pretty good thing. Well, the same thing happened in Korea. Most ball players who were called to service stayed in the United States. Some went to Europe. Remember, there's a Cold War in Europe. The Soviet Union controls. Remember the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union controls half of Europe. So some soldiers go to Europe. Kurt Simmons went to Europe. He didn't go to Korea. Just a few actually served in Korea. There were 4 active major leaguers whose military service took them to Korea. Jerry Coleman, Ted Williams, an outfielder named Lloyd Merriman, who we've kind of forgotten about, and Bobby Brown, a doctor who actually served at a MASH hospital and later, of course, became president of the American League.
You talked about J.W. Porter. Can you share a story of any other players whose career trajectory? You also talked about Willie Mays might have been permanently altered by the war.
Sure. Let me give you a couple. Some baseball fans may remember the name Tony Bartiromo, who finished his career not as a player but as a trainer for the Pittsburgh Pirates. But he had been a major leaguer before Korea. He played 124 games for the Pirates in 1952 and spent the next 2 years in the Army. And he told Ron Kaplan, my friend, he said, I was stationed in Berlin. The war wasn't hot, but we were under a lot of pressure because, as you know, Berlin was behind the Iron Curtain. And then he added, when you miss 2 seasons, you're bound to lose something. I know I lost a step or two, but I was proud to serve my country. He did not play in the major leagues again. Del Crandall, on the other hand, catcher for the Braves, when they win the 2 pennants in 57 and 58 in the World Series.
Later a manager. He was a manager at
Yes, he
one
was, right. Made his major league debut in June 1949, and he said, I came to the major leagues at the age of 19 and spent 1.5 years in the majors before going into the service. I felt the time in the service helped me to mature and overall was good for me. But I was fortunate to play ball in the States and in Japan. Therefore, I came out of the service in good shape. Vernon Law said the opposite. You can't be away from the game for 2 years without it affecting your arm strength and your batting eye. So yes, military service did affect my ability. So it's a mixed bag. Some people thought being in the service hurt their careers. Some were not so sure.
Hey, here's a funny question for you. I don't know if you can answer this. Del Crandall. He didn't see combat. It was the same thing in football. In some of the wars, players didn't see combat. They trained at the Great Lakes Naval Training Academy. They didn't actually see any combat time. Like Ted Williams saw combat time, as well as many others. Do you think? Again, this is personal opinion. You don't have to answer it. You might not
Okay.
know how to answer it. That any of those guys that were in the armed forces, but got to play baseball, got to play football, and didn't see combat time, you think any of them felt any guilt at all?
Well, that's a tough question, of course, and it probably varies from player to player, but I would think that in the last analysis, people who didn't see combat felt lucky,
Mm-hmm.
especially if they knew others who did. Um, the, this book is about Korea, of course, and what we learn about the war as you read those sections is that this was terrible. I mean, Korea was awful. The title of the book is deliberate: warm summers, very warm summers, and cold winters. And we mean temperatures of 30, 40, 50 degrees below zero. Yes, and to put anybody in that situation has to have a deleterious effect upon them.
What about the players that were affected who lost their prime years? Your friend Ron Kaplan, did you say?
Ron Kaplan, yes.
Ron Kaplan, he did some interviews. I don't know how many interviews you were fortunate enough to conduct. Um, the players that lost some of those prime years, did they view service as a sacrifice? They're proud of it. Did they view it as a setback? Both. How did some of those players that lost time, and you mentioned J.W. Porter,
Mm-hmm.
how did they view it?
Well, I think the outstanding example is Jerry Coleman, who flew combat missions during World War II, then played with the Yankees, was recalled to service and flew combat missions in Korea and was nearly killed on at least 2 occasions, and was eventually grounded because, as he said, things were beginning to get to me, meaning he was having some emotional difficulties. I think Jerry Coleman is the outstanding example of someone who said, my country called me and I served willingly and proudly. But for others, their attitude, I think, is influenced by the fact that this war was an uncertain war. What's the goal here? What are we trying to accomplish? How will we know when we win the war or when it will be over? And then, of course, when it does end in 1953, with basically the border that was existing beforehand, a cessation of hostilities, but no peace treaty, people are wondering, why did we do this? What was this all about? Why did we sacrifice? And Korea, it becomes a part of people's memory that they don't want to think about because there are not positive thoughts in so many cases.
You know, one of the interesting things that you did, um, when you write the dedication to a book, it's usually family members, friends, you know, your wife, your husband, your son, your daughter, your mom, your dad. You dedicated your book to players who lost their lives in that war. How important was it for you to center those forgotten names?
This was a thought that evolved. It was not my plan to dedicate the book to those citizen soldiers at the very beginning, but the more I read, the more I learned, the more I wrote about these players and others. I decided that they deserved some recognition. You know, there's an old aphorism that says um, each of us dies twice. Once when our body dies, and second when somebody says our name for the last time.
Mm,
That's profound, I think.
yeah,
Now
that's
I
really
know 21 ball players, one former major leaguer, and 20 minor leaguers served their country and gave their lives for their country. That is a profound sacrifice. Everybody knows that. And I'm sure that within their communities and certainly within their families, their memory lives on. But in the baseball community, these guys have been forgotten. And so I spend a paragraph or two on each of these guys when their time came to talk about what their sacrifice involved. And I decided to dedicate the book to the 21 players who lost their lives and to the one former ball player, a minor leaguer, who was taken prisoner and suffered unbelievably under the authority of the Chinese.
all right, Steve. We've discussed some of the darker moments of the book. Let's talk about some of the fun stuff. You know,
Okay.
while the war was going on,
Yes,
baseball still produced some very iconic moments.
you bet.
You already talked about, you know, the Whiz Kids, Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle and Bobby Thompson's shot heard round the world. Talk about some of that and maybe
Yeah. These
how do you reconcile this great stuff that happened during such a hard time in American history?
Yeah, well, I think overall we can say that although a number of players were called to service, the quality of play did not decline as it did in the last years of World War II. And so these were four exciting major league seasons. 1950, the Yankees in the American League with a very good team, um, and the Whiz Kids in the National League, young players who all kind of come up to the majors together, not the entire roster, but a good bunch of them. They're promoted from the minor leagues to the Phillies, and their manager is promoted, Eddie Sawyer, to lead them, and they win the pennant. They're so young. They're called the Whiz Kids, and win the National League pennant on the last day of the season against the Dodgers, and then lose four straight to the Yankees in the World Series. Boy, was a bigger balloon ever burst so quickly? I don't think so. Of course, the following season, 1951, Mays makes his debut. Mantle makes his debut. DiMaggio says this will be my last year. The Dodgers have a 13 and a half game lead on the Giants in mid-August, and of course lose the pennant to Bobby Thompson's shot heard round the world.
One of the most famous hits in the history of baseball, home runs in the history of baseball. One of the most famous pennant races in the history of baseball. It happened during this time. So
Yeah,
baseball was still on the headlines for
that's right.
some
I mean,
really good stuff.
yes, this is a glorious moment for Giant fans, of course. I know some old Brooklyn Dodgers fans who say, I will get over it. Just give me some time.
My father hasn't. Yeah, I mean, great stuff. I mean, and then, you know, New York, gosh, I hate to say it, New York was sort of still the baseball universe was New York. You had the
Well,
Giants, you had the Dodgers, you had the Yankees, you had Mantle, you had Mays, you had Snyder. I mean, holy moly. It was a great time for baseball too
yeah,
during
yes, it
during
certainly
that
was.
time.
Yeah, it certainly was a great time for baseball in New York. In 52 and 53, of course, the Yankees win the American League pennant again, and they beat the Dodgers in the World Series um, both times. The 52 series, some people remember Billy Martin's miraculous catch of a little pop fly that was going to fall in and cause some havoc on the scoreboard. But he was the hero in 52, and of course, through 53, what Dodger fans knew deep in their hearts is that we were good, but we weren't good enough to beat the Yankees. That didn't happen for another 2 years, and then of course only once. You know, Roger Kahn. These are the boys of summer years, 1952 and 1953, and you know, between 1947 and 1959, you know, a New York team is 1960 New York teams in the World Series every year, every year. Either the Yankees, the Dodgers, the Giants, or sometimes two of the three.
Yeah.
So
And of
a
course,
golden age for New York baseball. Yes,
yeah, and of course the Giants won in 54, beating the Cleveland Indians.
right.
You know, you also talked about this. Television was, you know, had really become a part of the game as well. How did the rise of television during this time change baseball's relationship with the audience?
Boy, that's a good question. Baseball did not know what to do about television. You know, 20 years before, they didn't know what to do about radio. The common assumption was that if people could listen to games on the radio, they wouldn't bother coming to the ballpark. Of course, the opposite was true. People listened to games on the radio and they said to themselves, boy, this sounds like fun. Maybe we should be there in person. You know, we can analogize the situation to the music industry. When radio stations began playing records on the radio, record executives said, if we let them do this, people won't go out and buy the records. If they can listen to the song on the radio, they won't buy the record. But the opposite was true. People said, look, there's Frank Sinatra's latest recording. I love it so much, I need a copy of my very own.
So
I
I
don't
can
want
listen to it whenever I want.
exactly, exactly. But television is a different animal because it is so mesmerizing. You know, even today, if we listen to the radio, if we listen to a podcast, we are not staring at a screen. We are perhaps listening and doing something else at the same time. But television grabs our attention. And when baseball began to be televised, club owners, major league club owners, and minor league club owners did not know quite what to do. Television stations needed programming. People are going to watch only if we're broadcasting something. And baseball officials thought if we show them games on TV, they're not going to come to the ballpark. So they made an attempt, haphazard, screwy, to try to restrict the amount of baseball on television as a way to preserve attendance. But what they came to learn is that people weren't staying home to watch baseball on television. They were staying home to watch television because it is so mesmerizing. Go into a sports bar with some of your best friends, sit down, order your hamburgers, your fries, and your beers, and suddenly nobody's talking, everybody's watching the game on the screen. Even 70 years later, we are still mesmerized by television. Now, the major leagues eventually come to some accommodation and they figure out how to work with television, but the minor leagues suffer.
Yeah,
Now,
why did the minor leagues struggled so terribly during this time?
Well, for a number of reasons, but the one directly related to television is this. If I live in a small city that has a minor league team in a Class C or a Class B or a Class Single A league, and I've got a chance to stay home and watch the Yankees on television, that's not such a hard choice. And so minor league attendance declines. The minors had 2 or 3 great years after World War II, and then it was like somebody ripped the bottom out of the basket. And minor league attendance just declines throughout the 50s. The minor leagues almost go out of business by 1960 and have to be resurrected by a massive plan of support from the majors. It's one thing for a fan, let's say in Pittsburgh, to make a decision. Should I watch the Pirates on television or should I go to Forbes Field to see them in person? It's another thing for a fan in Montana. Say, should I go see the Great Falls team, Class B or the Class C team with a roster of nobodies? Or should I stay home and watch the game of the week and see 2 exciting major league teams? It's a very, very difficult problem, and baseball does not grapple with it very well.
But yeah, and I mean, attendance was down in the minors terribly during that time.
Yes.
And
Yes.
minors went through a somewhat of a metamorphosis. Speaking of metamorphosis, how did baseball overall, the game, how did the game change from the year before and how the game was played and structured the year before the Korean War and baseball's involvement in it? How was baseball different when the war finally ended?
Well, the biggest change is something we cannot ignore, and that is that slowly major league owners recognized that if we allow ourselves to sign African American players, the quality of play on the field will be much better. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a decade for every team to have a black player on its roster. But the National League integrates or desegregates faster than the American League, and those players we remember: Willie Mays, Henry Aaron, Ernie Banks. They're winning Don Newcomb. They're winning Rookie of the Year awards. They're winning Most Valuable Player awards. They're leading their team to the World Series. And when the Cy Young Award is created, Don Newcomb wins the Cy Young Award. The American League moves slower. And if you think of Major League Baseball overall, the National League stays ahead of the American League, except for the Yankees in overall quality of play, because they were, I won't say quicker, but less slow than the American League in integrating their rosters. That, I think, is the biggest change, and we simply can't ignore it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Steve, if World War II defined baseball's greatest sacrifice, what did the Korean War reveal about its resilience?
Well, after the first weeks of the war, remember that North Korea invades in June 1950 in the middle of the season. It becomes clear that baseball will be able to continue. Unless the international situation gets a lot worse than it is in the fall of 1950, there's going to be a 51 season and a 52 season and a 53 season. So baseball was resilient because it was easy to be resilient. Looking back at World War II, people know about the so-called green light letter, the letter that President Roosevelt wrote to Commissioner Landis saying baseball can continue. What they don't realize is that if this was a permission slip, it was a permission slip with an expiration date. And baseball went through the same question. Will there be a season next year after 42, after 43, and after 44? The future of the game was year by year. In Korea, there was that problem disappeared relatively quickly. And we knew that because we were fighting a limited war, because this was a police action under the auspices of the UN is that baseball's future was assured. There wasn't going to be a time when baseball would have to suspend operations. So if that's resiliency, well, it was an easy resiliency, I think.
Hmm. If this book changes how fans see one thing about baseball history, what do you hope that is?
Well, I hope fans who read it will see the interconnection between the game in those 4 seasons and the war. Korea is the forgotten war. I mean, when you think about Korea, what do most people think of? Well, maybe they think about MASH,
I was just going to say
the,
MASH.
the movie and the television show, which were both set in Korea, but really were about Vietnam and the problems, the absurdity of that conflict in a certain sense. But beyond that, maybe you remember the Manchurian Candidate, brainwashing. Maybe if you're a real movie buff, remember a movie called Pork Chop Hill with Gregory Peck, which is a really interesting film. It was made in the late 50s and really asks questions about the Korean War. But beyond that, it's the forgotten war. It's the forgotten war. We just kind of glide over it. I think I'm not indicting anybody, but I think it's indicative that we know which ball players served in the military during World War II to the man. And we don't about Korea. The lists that exist are incomplete. They need work, and I'm not sure there's anybody who can put in a list together.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Steve Gietschier, Warm Summers and Cold Winters, How Baseball Survived the Korean War. A very interesting book, certainly a topic that I never thought I'd cover on Sports Forgotten Heroes, but you're right, it's the forgotten war, and it fits the topic, the way you analyzed it along with baseball. Really an interesting book, and I just want to say thank you for spending so much time with me today on Sports Forgotten Heroes. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to talk with you. I'm glad you enjoyed the book, and I hope others will pick it up and see what they think too. Thanks so much.
You got it. Anytime. I'm not really sure how to add much more to today's discussion, with the exception of you gotta wonder how many careers have been affected over the course of time by war in all sports. Sure, we know about Ted Williams, Yogi Berra, and so many others. But how many had bright futures ahead of them and whose career and maybe life were tragically lost? Hey, thanks again to my guest today, Steve Gietschier, for joining, and thanks to all of you for hanging out. And I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.